Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of my 5-part series on advanced strategy and theory in Marvel Champions. If you haven't already, I encourage you to watch part 1, which was on card evaluation. I will be conducting this video as if you've already watched that one, so I won't necessarily repeat myself every time I introduce a term or one of the fundamental concepts that I talked about in that first video, just to save some time. But hopefully you can get by just on context if you haven't watched it already. This video will be on the topic of hero evaluation, which builds directly from part 1, since a significant part to understanding and mastering heroes in this game is understanding the strengths and weaknesses among their 15 identity-specific cards. There will be 2 threads that I carry throughout this video. One is that I want to give practical advice on ways to analyze and build decks for any hero in the game. The other is I want to discuss, I'll be discussing some things of what makes heroes stronger or weaker relative to other heroes. And I just want to be upfront in recognizing that this carries less practical weight, since of course we can't change the identity-specific cards that come with the hero. But it is fun to talk about, and this could help you get better at the game in a sort of abstract way if you can rationalize why the strong heroes are strong, why the weak heroes are weak. Might give you a better idea for some of the matchups you want to do in some of your games. If it's a hard scenario, you want to play one of the stronger heroes. But I want this video to come across as a way to build around any hero, not just have a path towards finding the single best hero and having that be the only hero you ever play. I won't dive too deep into any individual heroes for this video. I'll talk about plenty of specific cards, but I won't go too deep on a singular hero. But do be on the lookout for future videos from me that are deeper dives into specific heroes, and this hero evaluation video will be foundational for those. Once again, I'm scripting this out just to have all my words down. So if you'd rather read the written text for one reason or another, you can check out the transcript in the description. All right, so this video will be organized into 4 topics. 1, the identity card with alter ego and hero forms. Number 2, the identity-specific cards that go into a hero's deck and the different categories among those. Number 3, the available trait, payoff, aspect, and basic cards for any hero. So not necessarily just what comes in the hero's identity-specific set, but what are the cards that sort of can exclusively be played by heroes with the attributes that the hero has. And lastly, some of the scenario-specific features that can relatively impact the power level of a hero, based off of having steady or stalwart, for example, affects the strength of heroes. So we'll talk about some of those things that can change our relative evaluation of heroes. So with that, let's get into it, starting with the identity card. So the identity card is probably the most important element of a hero kit, I would say. It's always the starting point for my evaluations. It's also just the most obvious, first thing when you open the pack. But the reason it's so important is because we start the game with it in play. And so it gives us the stats and abilities that will be available to us every single turn of the game, including, those early turns. If a hero has really strong identity-specific cards in its deck, still need to draw them at the right time, still need to spend resources on them to get their value. If we have a strong identity card, that gives a character massive consistency in the form of abilities that can be used every single turn. And it gives us the potential for really strong turns 1 and 2, which I believe are the most important turns of the game as we're getting set up before we've drawn all our encounter cards, right? If we have some value generation just from our hero right away, that's going to help us to transition smoothly into the first few turns of the game, into the middle of the game. Which, of course, is all because our identity is in play right from the very beginning of the game. We don't have to just wait to draw it. So the first thing we can check on the identity card is the hand size. Nowadays, heroes have pretty much settled into having a 6-card hand size in alter ego form and a 5-card hand size in hero form. But there are a handful of exceptions in the game. She-Hulk, Thor, Hulk, Ironheart. These are some examples that have 4-card starting hand sizes in hero form. Thor and Hulk even go down to 5 cards in alter ego form. you don't need to be a super expert in the game to understand why this is really bad for a character. It's fewer resources to use each turn, or every other turn if it's the hero hand size that's diminished. Which limits just how much stuff you can do on your turn. You also have fewer different combinations of cards to play that can help you craft an efficient turn, right? The amount of cards you have in hand sort of exponentially increases the different combinations of cards that grant you flexibility on any given turn. Lower hand size heroes, that you're slightly more likely to want to play card draw effects such as Avengers Mansion, or hand smoothing effects like Assess the Situation, right? These 1-cost cards, or 0-cost 1 ER card that makes it pretty easy to spend your whole hand of resources any given turn. Plan B, a similar one, is just a place to put 1 resource every turn, just because we have that increased likelihood of wasting resources in hand without as many combinations of cards to conduct any given turn. We also just, in general, we want to reach a point in the game with any hero where our value generation is keeping pace or eventually outpacing what comes at us in the villain phase and what we need to do just to stay alive. And so these low hand size heroes, you might need to play an extra value generator or two, have an extra one in play in order to reach this point where your value generation is matching what the encounter deck is throwing at you. And then this is a theme I'll return to throughout the series. Next is our identity's hit points. So about 10 hit points is the standard. Some heroes have a little bit less than this, like 9. A few heroes have a little bit more than this, 11 or 12. There's some that, like Thor and SPDR, that reach up to 14 hit points. Hulk has the most with 18 hit points. One way to think of these resources, obviously it's better to have more hit points, of course, why not? One way to think about it is sort of like having these initial setup resources. So if you think about having a 14 hit point hero, you can take 1 villain attack, maybe end up around 10 health. You'd be at the same place as a 10 hit point hero who maybe spent 2 resources worth to block a villain attack, either through a stun or an ally block. And so it's like giving the high hit point characters it's sort of an early resource advantage in a way. Gives them a little more breathing room to spend those early turns putting value generators, resource generators into play, rather than desperately looking for an ally to block with or an effect to stun the villain with. Give you some more breathing room on that first turn. A character's 4 basic power stats are also found on the identity card. Most characters have either 1 or 2 thwart and 1 or 2 attack. Obviously, you'd rather it be 2 than 1, and it's better if it is. A lot of the best heroes in the game, they've got 2 thwart and 2 attack, which just makes sure we have an efficient and flexible use of our basic power every single turn, especially in solo. If a character has at least 1 stat, that's 2. We won't complain too much. It gives us an efficient use of our basic activation every turn, but there's always times where you might be forced to use your weaker stat because of a certain encounter card that you really need to clear. So it's still a downside to have either of these stats be as low as 1. Like for example, if we've got 1 thwart and 2 attack, it might be hard to play a solo protection deck, for example, because that's just an aspect that generally struggles with thwarting. We have that thwart ability every turn of the game with our hero, so we'd rather, 1 versus 2, it ends up being a big difference when you consider the length of the game and how many turns you might be forced to thwart because you don't have that good of access to thwarting in protections options. Defense is an interesting stat. It's interesting because you should almost never, like from a HP management standpoint, you should almost never use your basic defense unless you're in this like defend heavy protection archetype, which is definitely a viable strategy. But most heroes in the game have a recover value that is larger than their defense stat, and I don't think there's any case where it's lower than your defense stat. It might be even, right? You'd always rather recover 3 or 4 health than defend to prevent 1 or 2 health. You're exhausted either way. You end up with greater hit points if you've recovered. And even if it's the same, like 3 recover and 3 defense, which 3 defense is about as high as you get just from the identity card, You'd rather just take the damage first, wait to see your encounter cards, because then you can decide if, maybe you end up drawing something you really need to attack or really need to thwart. You can just wait to recover and, leave yourself some flexibility there. Now, of course, in the middle of the game, you might have to defend just to save your life, but again, that's relatively rare. As I discussed in the last video, that there's a difference between what we want to plan on doing and then what we actually do when we're in the middle of the game and we're in a specific scenario with a lot more information. Right? We should never, if we've got a hero who's got 3 recover and 2 defense, we should never really plan on defending unless we absolutely need to. But of course, the correct play in the game, if you're about to die, of course you'll defend if that's the best thing for you to do. And then sort of ignore all that if we do want to dive into this defend heavy archetype with cards like unflappable or hard to ignore that reward defending and taking no damage. If our hero's defense stat gets up to 3, that's really what I'd be looking for to indicate that I should try to do this with the deck. And there's several heroes that do have 3 defense. I'll repeat one more point from the last video, which is that just having these 4 basic powers, it gives our turns lots of flexibility, right, between recovering, attacking, or thwarting. In solo, it's really good to be well-rounded with our stats since we're on our own to adapt to whatever happens in the villain phase. But in multiplayer, we can lean much harder into exploiting our character's best stat since the attacking, thwarting, and defending roles can be distributed across the table. So that there's not as much pressure to use our weaker stats just because we don't have any better options on the table. Next on our identity card, we have alter ego and hero abilities. So there's a lot of diverse abilities here, so a bit hard to generalize, but the type of ability that characterizes the best heroes in the game, in my opinion, is one that generates additional resources or free value. So someone like Captain Marvel, who can draw a card every turn in alter ego form. Someone like Magneto, who can draw a magnetic card every turn in hero form. I would also include in this way someone like Storm, who gets a free external resource in the form of her weather deck, which is roughly about a resource of value every turn or a little more. So for the same reason that having a low hand size hero is a pretty significant disadvantage to a hero, having free resources on the identity card are a massive advantage. It really helps those first few turns of the game to answer threats before we've drawn and played our best setup cards, or it can help us set up early value plays when we're just not pressured for that tempo, and so then that compounds in value the earlier we get that out. If we have a hero that gives us resources conditionally, like Rocket or Thor, for example, this is something we should consider building our deck around in order to access that value, right? Having more resources is just generally going to give us more stuff to do and give us better turns overall. In terms of just ranking, what heroes are powerful or not, it's actually pretty common for identity cards to have some ability that generates additional resources or that generate additional value. So if a character doesn't have one, like they might not have any active downsides really, like Hulk discarding your hand every turn. Even if you don't have an active downside, just simply not having a resource positive ability is something that I'm going to judge harshly in a hero because right, by comparison, that's just going to be worse than someone who can just draw a card every turn, for example. So for a lot of the different card types in this video, I want to make sure I'll show some examples of what I consider to be stronger or weaker cards in the category, just to give some more specific examples to allow us to dive into some individual cards, even though I won't be talking about every single hero. I think one pretty good example of an elite identity card would be Bishops. So he has 2 thwart and 2 attack, 4 recover and 12 hit points, both of those being a bit above average. And of course, 2 thwart, 2 attack being very solid. He's only got 1 defense, but like I mentioned, I don't really judge that too harshly when we've got a recover of 4. And if you think about Bishop's hero ability, it would be anti-synergistic there. But anyways, it's not like I'm criticizing Bishop too much for having only 1 defense. Then we've got resource positive abilities on actually both sides of his hero card. So when you flip to Alter Ego, we draw a temporal card, which in his case is often even a double resource card. In hero form, when he gets hit by an attack, we discard cards from the top and potentially add some discarded resources to hand. So 2 really strong value-generating abilities. And something like this, even without looking at Bishop's identity-specific cards, right, we still get to put 25 to 35 aspect or basic cards in our deck. And I know that sort of whatever I do with that, like Bishop's going to be an incredible hero just because of how strong this identity card is that's in play from the very start of the game, and I can use it every turn. Right, a weaker hero, we can compensate for some of their cards by just putting in 35 aspect and basic cards that we really want to play. But that identity-specific card is kind of the non-negotiable piece. So when we see something as strong as Bishop, like that's a really, really strong hero. A hero at the other end of the spectrum would be someone like Hawkeye. Sorry for any Hawkeye fans out there, but if we just sort of look at him objectively, we can see how he's missing some of these things that I would typically consider a good hero, right? He's got a slightly below average hit points, only 9 hit points, smaller thwart stat. His attack stat's fine, 2. In fact, when you play the bow, usually you get up to 3. But sort of the biggest knock, like I mentioned, he's got no continuous resource positive ability in either form. Even this Alter Ego form, first turn of the game, you have to spend a resource to get his bow. This ability to ready his bow in hero form, I wouldn't consider it a resource positive ability. Like, yes, it might be necessary, it might be the best thing on any given turn to exhaust, to allow you to play multiple arrow events from hand. But I mean, there's a cost to exhausting Hawkeye there. It's not like we're netting a resource in the way of Captain Marvel or Magneto drawing cards. So, right, Hawkeye just lacking that makes me rank him fairly low. He does have the 6/5 hand size, so I would actually tend to rank him above a few of those heroes that have the lower hand size, because like I mentioned, I can just play 35 solid cards in his deck, ignore his arrow thing, and that mitigates, if we've got the 6/5 hand size, we're just going to have a good resource churn compared to someone like Hulk, who's got the smaller hand sizes and just has less total stuff to do. So those are a couple of examples. That's how I'll set up some of these other topics of like kind of a high end, a low end. If you're interested in doing this evaluation exercise for yourself on any given hero, you can just kind of see where they rank between the high end and low end for all these various categories. So moving on from the identity card, let's talk about the identity-specific cards that actually go into the deck. I wish I had a better term for those. I don't know what else to call them. The identity card and the identity-specific cards, but they're all identity-specific cards. I don't know. You know what I'm talking about. So I talked a lot about evaluating individual cards in part 1 of this series. So I'll do just a little refresher here. I have these target efficiencies for the most common effects in the game, like damage and threat removal. If an event meets or exceeds these efficiencies, that indicates a card that can be as efficient or more efficient than playing an ally on any given turn. Events tend to have more tempo, but right, if we just look at efficiency overall, allies is kind of the standard as we're looking at high difficulty gameplay, building for power level, having this sort of competitive mindset. Allies are just sort of the default, like, best thing to do. So if a card is above the rate of an ally, that's going to pique my interest and make me think there's something to build around there. If we think about value generating upgrades and supports, these tend to have high, possibly infinite efficiency ceilings if you can just use them every turn, but they take longer to realize their value, so tempo becomes a consideration. I'm going to talk about the different card categories commonly seen in a hero's identity-specific set. The signature ally, attacks, thwarts, we could call it HP mitigation cards, defense healing cards, resource generators, resource cards, and then I've got other category that I've got a few smaller topics in. Again, the power grading of these cards, not necessarily the most useful because we can't change the identity-specific cards that we play, but seeing our hero's strengths and weaknesses definitely informs what we'll do with the rest of our deck. So let's start with the identity-specific ally. Allies are always strong plays, as we discussed in the last video. Identity-specific allies even tend to be one notch above the average aspect or basic ally. So they are cards we very often play when drawn in hand. Last time we talked about a baseline efficiency for allies. Go check out that first video if you need a refresher on that. Identity-specific allies very often meet this baseline and add about a half a resource to maybe a resource and a half worth of bonus value. So here are a handful of good examples. Angel, this is Psylocke's signature ally. When he enters, he gives a ready to Psylocke, which is worth about a resource and a half, either thwarting for 3 or attacking for 3. Pip the Troll is Adam Warlock's signature ally. He's understated by maybe 1 attack or thwart from the baseline efficiency, but I assign that tough status to about 2 resources worth. So again, just punching above the baseline efficiency. Spider-Ham's signature ally, Captain Americat, has baseline efficiency, gives 1 extra resource from that 2 encounter when he enters. If we think our hero has an exceptionally strong signature ally, that might push us to tailor our deck around that ally. A couple different ways this can happen. If the strength comes from a powerful resource-positive enters play ability like Wolverine's Jubilee or Captain Marvel's Spider-Woman, that might lead us to choose an ally recursion strategy based around make the call or rapid response to replay that ally over and over again. If our ally offers more continuous value generation, like Spider-Woman's Captain Marvel or Ironheart's Brawn, we might build an ally healing/upgrading deck to squeeze as much value from those allies as possible to keep them around on board to get their value turn after turn. Do keep in mind when it comes to signature allies, we have the sidekick archetype, which gives a lot of extra health to a signature ally. It allows us to use another powerful card that's called Side by Side. This can be a really strong strategy for heroes with those top tier remain in play allies. And in general, don't forget about the card Call for Backup to give you more consistency for this type of strategy. And so this sort of analysis, this is demonstrating what I like to do with heroes. Right, we're finding some part of their kit that's maybe stronger than what the average hero has. And we use that as an opportunity to play an archetype that takes advantage of that strength. Right? In the case of allies, ally recursion, it's usually a very strong thing to do anyways, regardless of how good the signature ally is. But for the other card types, or for those allies that are particularly good with sidekick, it's fun to make note of strategies that might not be the default best strategies, but that are most effectively executed by that hero compared to other heroes. Right? I'm trying to leave plenty of room in this strategy series, to do more than just find the single best deck and we never play anything else, or we find the best, 25 aspect basic cards, and no matter who the hero is, we just give them that same set of 25 cards. I do ultimately want to have fun, even though I'm talking about sort of how to improve the skill level specifically, and finding the most uniquely powerful thing to do for any given hero is a really fun way to go about playing the game with a balance of high power gameplay and unique play experiences. Just a bit of a tangent there on philosophy here, but to show the other end of the spectrum for signature allies, here's a few that just don't impress me as much. So Hellcat, even Hellcat is an ally who meets baseline efficiency. So if depending on your hand, she might still be a very justifiable thing to play, but she doesn't give any extra value above that baseline of thwarting for 2 twice and then blocking. Returning her hand, it's this interesting ability, but that's sort of giving us 1 resource. The value of a block is around 2 resources, so it's not like a resource positive ability that I'm super jazzed about. War Machine, Iron Man's signature ally, also meets the baseline, right? Can just keep attacking and then block, totally fine. Use of a card, but nothing that really punches above. Again, like I said about evaluating heroes, with or without resource positive abilities, the bar in these signature allies is really quite high. We should expect about an extra resource of value from what we're getting, and just Iron Man or War Machine simply doesn't have that. It's got this nice ability to deal 1 damage to a bunch of enemies. In specific circumstances, that can definitely be strong, but in general, it's not a routinely used ability of War Machine. I mean, essentially you need to do about 4 damage with that to really feel good about it. So moving on to attacks. A hero's attacks can measure 2 really important things about them. First, how well they handle minions, and secondly, how well they can close out the game from damaging the villain. So the efficiency I try to target with damage dealing effects is 2 damage per resource spent. Last time I maybe say this, so we can't change our hero's identity specific cards, but even still looking at the efficiency, it indicates how often we should plan on playing those cards when we draw them in our hand. One nuance around efficiency with damage is the possibility for cards to waste damage on minions with less health than the attack deals. So if we take Spider-Man's Swinging Web Kick, for example, this has a really, really good efficiency of 2 damage per resource spent. But if we're using this to kill a 5 health minion, we effectively wasted 3 of that damage. We'd rather have something like Spider-Woman's Venom Blast, which has an efficiency of just under 2 damage per resource spent, 5 damage for 3 ER. But if the end result is being rid of this 5 HP minion, we've spent 1 fewer resource to do so. Another caveat with damage is the relatively low value of dealing damage to the villain for most of the game. Most games follow a pattern of stabilizing against threats, slowly building up resource generators, and then pushing damage once we have a comfortable excess of value relative to what we need to survive each turn to counter the villain phase. So villain damage, obviously it helps us win the game, but it doesn't help us at all in those early developing stages, which is where I argue we have the greatest risk of losing in those early turns of the game before we're set up. So villain damage doesn't really help us at all in that point. So I don't value it hugely. Most identity-specific attacks, they can attack minions or heroes. We see that limitation a bit more often in the aspect cards. But right, it's not. I just wanted to make that point here again. There's definitely still value to closing out the game in a timely fashion before we hit, we might feel like we've stabilized, but we hit an unlucky sequence of encounter cards that steals the victory for us. But if we have good high damage output, burst damage, high, single target attacks directed towards the villain at the end of the game, that's still a very strong thing to do. And I would categorize that in sort of the burst damage strength of a hero, or the rush damage if that's a strategy you want to employ. And so I would categorize Swinging Web Kick as this sort of card, a card that's more valuable in the late stage of the game because it's a very efficient way to put lots of resources towards damaging the villain. But since this is Spider-Man's only attack card, this might make you more inclined to supplement Spider-Man's deck with some better ways to address minions. Since if you're in a scenario with a bunch of 3 to 5 health minions, Swinging Web Kick, is not going to be the most efficient way to deal with those. A few heroes have a card like Storm's Blast of Wind here. It's sort of a low floor, high ceiling card, just depending on how many minions are engaged with you. When you play it, it doesn't send as much damage at the villain, for a final push. But if you've got like 4 minions in play, this is going to do like 12 damage to those minions. So insane efficiency in these minion heavy scenarios. So that can this card is relatively rare among heroes, but that's a great indicator that your hero is better equipped to handle high minion scenarios. Another thing that can influence your deck is just simply how many attack events your hero has. So there's a few cards here, Plan of Attack and Fluid Motion. These are cards that pay you off for having a high density of attacks in your deck. As I see this, I think of Test the Defense as well. This is a card that just racks up counters as you play attack events. So Wolverine is an example of a hero who's got a few different attack cards. Wasp has a couple different ones. So those are examples of heroes you might think to do this sort of all-in attack strategy with. Martial Prowess is a great resource generator to help enable this type of deck. I would typically only play this sort of all-in attack strategy in multiplayer, where other players can compensate on thwarting and defending. But just like with the Signature Ally, if your hero's attacks are some of your strongest cards and you want to play them often, a powerful thing to do is to build around those cards. I brought up several cards already, but I'll talk about a few more examples of some of the best and worst attacks. When it comes to attacks or I guess damage dealing cards, it doesn't necessarily need to say the word attack, like Blast of Wind in that previous example. The designers tend to be much more consistent in the different power level. If an attack deals less damage, it probably has some additional effect, like maybe it's only 6 damage, but you get piercing, or you apply a status to the villain or something like that. So there's honestly not that many examples of bad attack events. So Storm's card Thunderbolt is one of the most consistently high damaging cards in the game, or best efficiencies in the game. For an event, this ends up doing 10 damage for 4 ER, assuming you flipped to the Thunderstorm weather for Storm. SPDR's Web Trap is 5 damage per 3 ER, but adding that stun value as well, which I generally say is worth about 2 resources, makes this an incredibly strong card. Iron Man's Repulsor Blast, this is a good opportunity to talk about building towards upside in a card. So even hitting just 2 energy resources, if you do the math with this, if you hit 2 energy resources in your 5 discarded cards, you'll end up doing 5 damage for 2 ER, which is already just incredible efficiency at 2.5 damage per resource. But the upside can get as high as, I think the best you could do would be, or you'd get 11 if you hit 5 energy resources. You could technically get 13 if you have the double resource energy in there. So, right, no matter what the card type is, if it's an ally, attack, or whatever, I'm always trying to look for the upside in my cards to build around, to give that spike of power needed to take on some of the harder scenarios. Examples of worse attacks, and right, it was even really hard to find these. I think Big Hands is an easy one. It's just not that efficient of a card. 4 damage for 3 ER. Gamma Slam might be a bit surprising that I put it on here. I promise I reviewed a bunch of attacks. Like, there's not that many bad ones. But this is just an example of a card that's almost exclusively a finisher card. So indeed, it can be very good at that. You might deal 13 damage, the last turn of the game, even more if you've got some HP increasing upgrades. But it's so bad for the majority of the game because it probably addresses minions very inefficiently. You're not going to be getting to the higher damage totals until probably later in the game. And when you do that, you want to send it at the villain. So I'd rather see cards that are a bit more effective in these early stages to help put out fires, even though there's definitely value to just being able to snap your fingers and end the game at the end. But essentially, it's not the type of card I'm going to build around a ton, or it's not the card I'm going to plan on playing multiple times throughout the same game and doing this sort of all-in attack strategy. But maybe you build around the burst upside of it. You play your endurance or your symbiote suit. There's some upside to doing that, but just bear in mind that if an attack can't effectively deal with minions, it's maybe below the curve for what we should expect from our attack events. Thwarting events are almost exclusively less represented among identity-specific cards. This does make some sense from a design perspective. Attacks have to answer minions while giving us enough total damage to eventually win the game by defeating the villain. Thwarting is needed to answer side schemes and keep the main scheme in check, keep the main scheme from advancing, but rarely is it the mechanism for actually winning the game. My standard is, again, 2 threat removed per resource spent. Again, that might seem, and I've got some comments like that's kind of a high target efficiency, but you just look at allies. We can get this all the time in allies. So it's right. It's actually pretty rare for events, even hero events, to hit this efficiency. But I kind of just like that it's a nice round number of 2. Makes the math harder. I try to call it 1.7 or 1.8 or something. So, right, hero events, they very rarely even hit this standard unless they have some other ability like in the text, which is contributing to the total cost. But in terms of just a threat removed per ER spent, right, it's pretty rare to actually hit this efficiency. So while lots of heroes will have multiple different attack events, 2 or 3 different damage dealing cards, there are very few with even more than one unique threat removing event. But granted, you might get 2 or 3 copies of that card. When we think about a hero being good at thwarting, it's often because they have a basic thwart stat of 2, in rare cases even 3, like with Phoenix. But you generally just don't get a super high density of thwarting cards in your deck to say like, oh, that hero is great with thwarting. But we've got a couple more examples here. Storm is a pretty high up there thwarting hero. She's just good at a lot of things, but her Torrential Rain card, this is about as good as we get in terms of just the raw threat removed. If we've got the Hurricane Weather in play, this is 5 threat removed for 3 ER. Something like Magic's Exorcism, this is an example of a card that if you just look at the threat removed and the ER, it's not crazy, it's not more than 4 justice, but you get that confuse application as well, which is super valuable. So, right, because of that confused status, Exorcism, it's still a card that I want to play. Most times I draw it. So sometimes I like doing a thwarting strategy with Magic because I have this powerful thwart card I want to play a lot of the time that I see it. When we do have a hero with efficient or otherwise powerful thwarting effects, one way to build around that is with player side schemes. So player side schemes, these have been a great addition to the game. They're just very powerful cards overall, but if we're encouraged to thwart with our hero, they give us a place to put our thwarting effects and benefit the table, even if we didn't draw any side schemes in the last villain phase, or if the main scheme does not have a terribly difficult threat, maybe because we spent the last villain phase in hero form. Sense of Justice is an available resource generator for a deck built around thwarting. Overwatch is a nice payoff card for heroes with a thwart event that removes 4 or more threats in one chunk. Though, I mean, even this is like, it's meeting my target efficiency if it even removes 2 threats. So like, I mean, this is just a crazy card. But the more threat that's removed by a hero's individual thwarting event, just the more excited I get about the possibility of playing some copies of Overwatch. So it is generally harder to build around thwarting effects, but if that's a hero's strength, but it's definitely a deficiency in a hero that I want to correct if they have weak thwarting. So someone like Iceman has a thwart of only 1. His identity-specific thwart has relatively poor efficiency, 1 threat removed per ER. Hulk is obviously one of the worst. He's got 0 thwart, and his hero form, his thwart event is pretty inefficient as well. And like I said with attacks, if we're in a multiplayer game, we shouldn't worry too much about compensating for this deficiency because other players can help us with threat removal while we lean into whatever our hero excels at, like Hulk, just go attack, just go smash minions and smash the villain. But in solo, additional thwarting, aspect, and basic cards are must-haves to manage this part of the game if our hero does not have its own tools to do so. And so in general, we can look to allies. We can play Snow Guard or a Machine Man or just Deadpool. Any of these basic allies that give us thwarting at a pretty decent rate. All right, next we'll talk about defense cards or damage prevention / healing cards, kind of a bucket there relating to hit point management. What I typically benchmark these against, it's a bit more tenuous of a benchmark, but if the value of blocking a villain attack is worth about 2 resources, whether with the stun status, tough status, or the final hit point of an ally, then if we say the average attack is about 4 damage, then it's about 2 hit points per resource, or just in general, I like to say 2 resources to block an entire villain attack is what I benchmark these sorts of cards against. So if we just start with some damage prevention examples, cards like Spider-Man's Backflip or Captain America's Shield Block, these prevent all damage from an attack for only 1 effective resource. So those are excellent plays. Usually we get that for the cost of 2 resources. Some 2 ER hero defenses, we might add some additional abilities, or Rogue's Bulletproof Bell effectively blocks 2 attacks, blocking 1 attack and giving a tough to block the next one. Nova's Force Field Projection, it only blocks finite damage, but it also adds, 3 is still a significant amount of damage. That might be most attacks in certain scenarios, but it also adds an additional 3 damage to an enemy. So maybe that kills a minion before it gets to activate against you. One really big upside to these types of cards to be on the lookout for is being able to react to the damage that would be taken as opposed to the initiation of the attack. So a potential issue with cards like Gambit's Natural Agility or many protection defenses that work this way is that if you play it when you defend, you run the risk of wasting value if the attack ends up not being that strong because you drew a 0 boost icon card. And even Gambit's card here, it's still a fine card. It's just not at the level of those first few that they're reactive and they prevent all the damage. So something like Nova's Force Field Projection, Spider-Man's Backflip, right? These let you have the information of how much damage the attack would deal first, which then helps you decide whether or not it's best for your turn overall. You look at your whole hand, how you want to spend your resources. You just get an additional piece of information to decide if that's the best way to spend your turn. It involves playing that card. Even better, in some rare cases, this ability will come on an upgrade. So something like Spider-Ham's Cartoon Physics, which you can even just leave in play until you take an attack that's big enough where you want to do that. So it doesn't clog up your hand from holding it, or you don't have to draw it at the perfect time, because you want to spend all your hand's previous resources and just cross your fingers, hope you draw it going into the next fill-in phase. There's less risk with a card like Cartoon Physics. You just let it sit in play and wait for the right moment to use it. There aren't many examples of bad damage prevention cards. Just another category where they're just in a pretty consistent. I mean, the designers know about efficiency and stuff, so like they never make cards that are just atrocious. If I had to pick some of the worst, I would say Cable's Telekinetic Force Field and Captain Marvel's Cosmic Flight. Even between these, like Cosmic Flight is a real outlier here. Like this is even significantly worse than Cable's card. But they don't quite compare favorably to any just 2-cost ally who can come in and block a full attack and do other ally shenanigans on top of that. So there's always situations where having cards like this are nice. I'll bring up one later in the video. We'll talk about some overkill, but just on average, they're not cards that make me go, ooh, I'm going to build my deck around this type of card, because it's just not overly efficient. If we change to healing cards, there's only actually a handful of heroes with healing events. So X-23 and Wolverine, these cost 2 ER and heal 4. So that's about on par with my estimate of 2 ER to block an attack. We'd often rather have the additional flexibility still that comes with an ally, or if we stun the villain, we avoid any detrimental boost effects. But these heroes happen to be ones that are using their health as a resource. X-23 to ready Wolverine to play attack events. So these are still frequently played cards for me. There are, I think, more supports overall that heal. The pinnacle of this is Aunt May, which is a card for Spider-Man, right? Healing 4 health a turn is like just absolutely insane. Storm's Aurora's Garden is, I think, a bit more reasonably balanced one. You can heal 4 over one flip down cycle for 2 ER. Value can accumulate from there if you get a chance to do that again. So yeah, healing is solid when it comes on a support like this. It's obviously great when it's just an add-on to resource generating cards like Steve's Apartment, which is giving us a draw anyways, and the heal is just like a nice little bonus that gives us some more survivability. There's some cards it gives additional flexibility to, like Phoenix's White Hot Room. Ironheart has a similar card as well, where we can use it to make a resource, or we can just use it to heal. Like it's always just a notable aspect of an identity-specific kit. If we've got some extra healing, it tells us that character is going to be a little better against high damage output scenarios. If it's overkill or just damage that's coming from encounter cards outside of attacks. So how do we build around a hero that's good at damage mitigation or healing? An obvious one is using the ally Jocasta to recur a very powerful defense event. Nerves of Steel is a resource generator. in the same vein as martial prowess and sense of justice, which we've seen earlier, but Nerves of Steel is for defenses. Just note a lot of the best defenses, like backflip, they have a printed cost of 0, so this won't necessarily help those. Defense cards can enable you to play what's called a perfect defense strategy, which is you're playing cards like Unflappable that trigger when you defend and take no damage. I still would only tend to do this with a 3 defense hero, otherwise it won't be a super consistent strategy. But a few extra aces, in your identity specific set to mop up entire attacks, especially if you don't even have to exhaust, that could point you in this direction. One maybe underrated build, although I've heard it mentioned in other places as well, so can't totally claim this idea, but another build idea for heroes with good hit point management is an ally upgrade strategy. So, it's typically a really good strategy to cycle through allies as blockers. It's just very efficient to do that. But decks that play allies to buff their stats and heal them, that actually is a pretty efficient combo as well. Like healing buffed allies, that's just a really efficient exchange of resources for value. But you just can have the issue of then your hero is going to get attacked if you're not willing to block with your allies. So, so if you want to spend a turn, playing the Ronin ally and putting Inspired on him, but you're about to get attacked, like it's nice to have a hero who's just comfortable taking that attack to allow you that kind of setup turn, or just if your ally slots are otherwise dedicated to these upgraded, hit point buffed allies. Next card to talk about are resource generators. Resource generators are almost always some of the strongest cards a hero has, right? Because of that potentially infinite efficiency, using them every single turn. After a few turns, they're giving us more resources than we would have otherwise had, more resources to do stuff, play things from our hand. So obviously very, very strong cards, as long as the tempo hit of playing them isn't so big. So typically the better resource generators will be cheaper in cost. There's also a bit of a distinction between just generating resources, like a card like God of Thunder, generate a lightning resource, versus drawing cards. So when you draw a card, that's typically strictly better, because you could just use that card as a resource to pay for one of the cards you already had, or that card might be something better to play than what you had in hand. So there's like a flexibility there that always comes with drawing cards, between either spending that card as a resource or playing that card. When we think about total resource generation in a deck, sometimes we can have diminishing returns with just resource generators, because you only get so many things to play from hand every turn. With card drawers, we don't have the same drawback at all because of that flexibility. Some of the best value generators are cards that produce multiple resources of value every turn. So something like Black Panther's Golden City. This is just honestly one of the best cards in the game. Similar with Quicksilver's Friction Resistance, able to generate, at a default 2 resources, potentially even more on any given turn. I put Black Widow's Safe House on here as well. So first of all, it costs only 1, so that's pretty much as cheap as it can get. It only draws 1 card a turn, but it's got a really big upside of being able to select the card that you draw from your discard pile, as long as it's a preparation, of course. But that sort of upside in a 1-cost resource generator, that's just an extremely strong card. A less good value generator would be She-Hulk's Focused Rage or Thor's Asgard, basically because they just cost 3. Right? Even these are better than what you typically might get from Aspect or Basic cards. Right? They're cheaper than Avengers Mansion. Their Helicarrier is about the same cost, but drawing a card is better than getting the resource from Helicarrier. So you'll happily still play either of these at some point in the game. It's just not as necessary to play them immediately when you draw them, because of the bigger tempo loss. There might be some more immediate threat that you need to deal with. If a hero has one of the top tier value generators, I'm highly inclined to play the player side scheme's Build Support or Superpower Training, of course, whether it's a support or an upgrade, because that just gives us another shot of getting those in play as early as possible. I'm a bit more inclined to do that when the card costs 2, especially if it costs 3. even if it's a great card like Black Widow's Safe House and it costs 1, it's just so cheap to play whenever we draw it. It feels really good to cheat on resources when we put in something that costs more resources, like 2 or even up to 3 resources. With superpower training, there's actually no limitation on the cost, so we can put anything crazy in from our deck with that one. So similar to resource generators are resource cards. So Magneto's Master of Magnetism or Hulk's Limitless Strength. These are obviously great cards because they give you 2 or 3 resources for the price of 1. As we consider our deck's overall composition, the existence of identity-specific resources, it makes me far less likely to play additional aspect or basic resource cards beyond Energy, Genius, and Strength, which are auto includes in 99% of decks, because the risk of drawing a handful of resources, there's a risk of drawing a hand with too many resources and not as many things to actually play to spend those resources on. So there's diminishing returns with these free value cards. I'm also going to lean more towards putting cards that cost 2 or more resources in my deck, because on average, right, they're going to be more powerful than 0 and 1 cost cards, and they cost 2. But in a handful of 1 cost cards and double resources, right, we aren't really going to get the additional benefit from those double resources that we would be getting if we were playing more powerful 2 or 3 cost cards. If we look at the total number of resource cards and resource generators or value generators in the deck together, there's not really one magic number we should try to hit. Like I mentioned, we do need a baseline of value generation in order to take on some of these more difficult scenarios. So in general, I think ballpark, I put down about 8 to 10 total resource cards plus value generating cards, because maybe we play 5 resource cards, 4 or 5 resource cards, the main 3, maybe the power-ofs. If we don't play the power-ofs, maybe we play one of the singleton ones like Audacity. And then for value generators, our hero probably comes with 2, maybe 3. You can put a couple extra ones in there. That puts us at about 8 to 10 total resources. So if your hero doesn't come with that many, I'm inclined to play a few extra among the aspect and basic cards. If your hero is overloaded already, especially if you've got extra resource cards, right, the double resources from hand, those are less flexible overall, so I'm a bit less inclined to play more resource generators because I don't want to end up with these awkward turns. And this rule, it's a general rule, but it's going to vary widely from hero to hero depending on what your deck is trying to do. That's a complex topic, but just keep in mind this balance between what's already coming in your identity-specific set and sort of fill up to the amount you want from your aspect and basic cards. All right, so last is this other category that I want to acknowledge a few common card abilities across several heroes, but they don't maybe have the extent to deserve their own category. So one is upgrades with the ability to ready a hero. So there's a handful of heroes who have something like this. And I guess, you could expand this to the larger category of upgrades or supports that contribute damage or thwart somewhere, as opposed to just generating additional resources to play other cards, but those come in lots of varieties as well. I would say the same things about, great overall value, poor initial tempo maybe, and so you got to gauge how many of those low tempo cards you have in your deck. But that's maybe a topic for the next video. But when it comes to readying cards, right, these are really powerful cards. These are cards that combo well with stat buffing effects like combat training or heroic intuition. So if I see my hero's got one of these readying effects, I'm more likely to play one of those. They're really flexible cards, right? Just because our hero activation is inherently very flexible already. So being able to do that twice is very powerful. Something I've valued a lot more recently is like being able to exhaust your hero as just the cost of lots of different encounter cards. So, right, if it's an encounter card you really need to get rid of, but you need to exhaust, right, having one of these upgrades is really powerful to allow you to deal with those sorts of threats. These are just typically very strong. I notch, heroes get a notch stronger when you see a card like this in there. And for deck building purposes, right? It combos well with stat buffing cards. Another category we see a lot is cards that cancel the effects of encounter cards. So this could be like Spider-Man's Enhanced Spider Sense or Deadpool's Meta Knowledge. Sometimes it only cancels the Treacheries when revealed effect. Sometimes it cancels the whole card. So be careful which it actually does. Obviously, it's better if we can cancel the whole card. These effects, they're usually cheap enough to efficiently answer just whatever encounter card if we have the opportunity to play it. But they also protect heroes against some of the worst case scenario cards like Shadow of the Past. So this is the kind of card that can really like push a hero up a tier grade for me, or up a half a grade, because right we end up getting at these points in games where we're maybe outvaluing the average villain phase. We feel like we've stabilized, but there's like this worst case scenario turn, like we draw the one advance, or we draw this one, overkill attack like encounter card, and it's like, as long as we don't draw that, we're going to win the game. Well, heroes who have access to this encounter canceling ability, which is not very readily available in aspect and basic cards, those heroes have a tool to fight against that. Even if you have to be a little bit inefficient with maybe holding that card in hand at the end of turns, you've just got that safety valve. You've unlocked this certain percentage of this certain win percentage where you would deal with these worst case scenarios, where just the best way to answer that is just to counter it straight up with one of these hero cards. So really like those cards as well. A category of card that we see a bit as well that I'm not as big a fan of is these effects that shuffle your identity-specific cards back into your deck. So this could be like Magneto's Asteroid M, Quicksilver's Serval Industries, or Black Panther's Ancestral Knowledge. Right? They give no immediate tempo, no direct efficiency in the form of like drawing cards or doing damage or generating extra resources. They do improve your later draws. So in a sense, you could think about them having efficiency in terms of like the net value that the reshuffled card has over the average card in your deck that you would have drawn. You can kind of think of it something like that. But I mean, most cards aren't on some like massively different power bracket than other cards. There's a lot of variation in when you actually draw those, so there's a big delay on the effect. I mean, they do some nice things, and certainly if you get it, if you've got only a few cards left in deck, you can play this effect, and you know exactly what you're going to draw the next turn. Like, they can do some nice things, but I don't go crazy when I see these types of cards, just because there's no tempo at all, and it kind of it's sort of a long-winded way to generate some value. So if you've got nothing else to play, sure, play it. They do some nice things. It's just hopefully we're playing decks where every resource spent is like a really precious resource, and we want them to go as far as possible. So I'm generally not a huge fan of these cards. Okay, so spoke a long time there about the different card categories among the identity-specific cards. The last specific thing to consider not the last thing, but if we just look at the hero in isolation before we look at some of the scenario features, one thing we can consider are the aspect and basic cards available to that hero based on traits or other characteristics of the identity-specific set. So for example, there are cards that can only be played by Avengers, or can only be played by Mystic characters, or maybe not specifically traits, but there's cards that can only be played by heroes with at least 14 hit points. And of course, not every hero is going to have access to these different cards. So there's this value to just being able to play these aspect and basic cards that you might not identify with just rifling through your hero pack for the first time and looking at your identity-specific cards. Similar to this, maybe not specifically trait locked, but there's some cards like Deft Focus or Face the Past that I consider these staple level cards in the sense that I'm going to look at the hero and evaluate whether or not I'm putting these cards in the deck pretty much just based off of the hero. In the case of Deft Focus, it's because there aren't that many superpower cards that aren't identity-specific cards. In the case of Face the Past, obviously that brings our nemesis into play, so it pretty much just depends how bad that hero's nemesis is. So, of course, our heroes will vary in value depending as well on how they can use some of these aspect and basic cards. So what I've done here is I've actually made a handy dandy little spreadsheet. Wanted to do this for a while, but this is an opportune time to do this for this video, which is that I've organized all of the different trait payoff cards into the different traits. And I'll sort of walk through how I've done this. I've put the link to this in the description. I'll also have this be one of the links on my channel homepage. But essentially, I've got the traits listed alphabetically here. So Ariel, Asgard, Avenger. Right, the most common ones are these team traits like Avenger, Champion, Guardian, etc. I've listed the heroes that have that trait. Mostly natively, I guess the aerial heroes here can often get it from the upgrade, so that's a pretty long list there. Hope I got everybody. I might have missed a few. I've then made two different columns showing the cards. So I wanted to differentiate a little bit the stronger cards from just, cards that also happen to be trait locked or are only enabled by characters with a certain traits. Just to give you some sense, like, if there was one trait that had 10 different payoff cards, but they were all pretty bad, like that wouldn't be as strong a trait to have versus a trait that's got like one or two really good premium cards. So I've made a bit of the differentiation there. It's sort of a value call. Specific heroes will change how good the cards are, but as just like a first pass, it's my thumbs up or thumbs down on the various cards. So how I intend you could use this is, you can just Control F, try to find your the hero you're trying to play. Let's say we're trying to play a Storm deck. I've been playing a lot of Storm recently. We can find where Storm is. Okay, so Storm is one of the heroes that can get Ariel from one of her upgrades, so she might consider playing some of these Ariel cards. She's also an X-Men. So what are some of the X-Men payoff cards here we can have? It's just kind of a useful check. Like, these are cards that we maybe don't consider for every single deck we make because we don't always have the trait, but they tend to be pretty powerful, right? As a general rule, the more restricted cards get in this game, the more efficient they become, just because it's harder to actually use them. So you might want to just remind yourself that, oh yeah, Marrow is a very strong card that an X-Men hero can play, or I can do a Utopia strategy, or I can give them a resource generator with XJet. And you can see what the other options are. Again, I'm not looking to pick any fights on these individual cards, but they're all there if you want to see the other X-Men payoffs, even if I put them in the second column. This sheet is just the basic cards, but we've also got tabs for each of the different aspects. So there's not quite as many of these payoff cards in the different aspects as there are in basic, but we've got all the aspects there: aggression, leadership, protection, justice. I've made one more tab here that has some of those cards I was referring to. I guess I left deft focus off here. I think I put that down here. Okay, yeah, if you've got lots of superpowers, you might be interested in deft focus or Hope Summers. But these are staples that are, right, they don't specifically call out a trait, so I guess I just made my own little page for them. And I didn't really have a strict criteria for what I put on this page. But it's just the sort of cards that, as I make this for my own purposes, it's the cards that I just never want to forget about, because there's certain heroes where like these cards are so good with those heroes that I'm just going to put the cards in that hero's deck regardless of like what the actual big picture strategy of my deck is going to be. So Face the Past is a perfect one. Just depends on what your nemesis is. Go check out this video by Journeyman2. He ranked all of the different nemesis for every hero in the game. So you'll get a sense for. I didn't want to go through it myself and like make a huge list here of the heroes I would play this with, but not too hard to identify for yourselves if that's a card your hero should be interested in playing. Sharpshooter for ranged attacks, Directed Force for ranged overkill and piercing attacks. There's a handful of heroes that get these very consistently from upgrades, so I'm always inclined to play Directed Force with some of those heroes. Build support, superpower training. Superpower training obviously can only be applicable based off of your hero because it can only get identity-specific upgrades. Build support you might still play because of what you're trying to do with your aspect and basic cards, but right, especially if you've got a hero with a really strong support like Black Panther, build support is just auto-include staple for me in those types of decks. Just a couple others, lock and load, right? Lots of heroes have a strong 2 or 3 cost weapon that's nice to get into play. Do need to be playing aggression, but it's still just another easy inclusion for those heroes. And Jocasta, I mentioned one of those ways to build around these strong defense events. I listed a few examples here. These have lots of eligible heroes. So if you really want to dig into it, you can go follow these Marvel CDB links and see some of the eligible heroes there. But yeah, feel free to use this or not. I made it kind of mostly for myself, but I'm obviously happy to share it if other people can find this useful. It's kind of cool to just look at as well and remind yourself of maybe some of the decks you can make, building around some of these hard cards, seeing what heroes you can use for it. So feel free to give that a look if you're interested in using that. But this is where a lot of the hidden value in a hero lies, because right, we don't see these aspect and basic cards when we just look at their identity-specific cards. I think if I could name one example, it would be Star-Lord. Star-Lord is someone who, well, for one thing, I didn't fully appreciate Star-Lord's rush potential when I was first evaluating him. But I just didn't really love Star-Lord's cards, right? They need the encounter cards to have even passable efficiency. They're kind of below efficiency at the start. Getting those encounter cards is a big cost if you're not ending the game that turn. But Star-Lord, because of that ability to turn every character into a Guardian, Star-Lord goes absolutely crazy with the card Blaze of Glory here. So just by Star-Lord enabling this Blaze of Glory, now you have this just like 10 out of 10 power level card. You can play 3 copies in your deck and just make these insanely strong Star-Lord decks. So that's one example where sometimes taking the second level look at a hero is really strong. I think a couple traits to shout out. So the champion trait is incredibly strong. You get this Go for Champions card. That's just one of the best cards in the game, especially in my heroic games. Go for Champions is a card that scales really interestingly into heroic. It gets even better in heroic relative to how it is in standard or expert. Moon Girl, one of the best allies in the game. So I think even someone like Ironheart is someone I underrated a little bit because of that low starting hand size. But even just having access to these 2 like insanely powerful cards puts Ironheart a step up for me. One other video, I'll link it in the description here. So there's a video done by Web Warrior Fanatic and Ancient Slumber. They went through, they played a fun game where they put all these different traits into a tier list. So if you want a bit more general discussion of like how strong it is to have the various traits, I could talk about that myself, or I could just send you to their great video where they went through all the traits. So encourage you to check that one out as well if you're interested in digging deeper into the strength of these most common hero traits. My last topic for evaluating heroes is how they respond to various adverse conditions that a scenario can present. So if the level 1 check of any hero is look at its cards, its stats, its value generation, its traits. Once we turn our attention to the features of specific scenarios, we can start to get a better sense for how a hero will perform in-game in some more specific contexts. So my biggest struggle with doing some sort of power ranking tier list of all the heroes is that the strength of a hero can vary wildly depending on the scenario features, depending on the matchup. So for example, if the villain is steady or stalwart, then a hero like Magic, whose strength comes in part from regularly stunning and confusing the villain, becomes noticeably worse than someone like maybe Wolverine, who is maybe just an equally strong hero, but doesn't have those status applications baked into the cost of his cards, and you're wasting that part of the value of those cards. But now maybe you flip to a scenario, maybe like Rhino, who does not have Stalwart, And, Magic's going to have a very easy time against him, stunning his big attacks, confusing him so the main scheme doesn't advance. Wolverine's not going to have as good of access to those types of effects. Similarly, a scenario where the villain has overkill is going to be better addressed by a hero with strong defense capabilities, because we can't just do our normal ally blocks to protect our life total, especially if that villain can become steady or stalwart somehow. We can't even stun. So a hero with good defense capabilities is just going to look a lot better in those matchups. If we got some card, if we've got Spider-Man with the backflip card to just negate a whole overkill attack, like that's a fantastic exchange. It's going to put him at a significant advantage over some other, equally strong hero who doesn't have that specific sort of effect. Healing goes into this as well, right? Spider-Man, he's got Aunt May as well, so maybe he can just take attacks into his hero more frequently, and he'll be able to heal it off using cards like Aunt May. So these heroes are going to be relatively better against a scenario like Ronin, who's very much defined by that fanaticism card, which even has piercing as well, so tough isn't a great answer to Ronin. Any scenario where you want to use the flight modular set gives the villain permanent overkill, very difficult addition to scenarios. Any scenario on Expert 2, there's the total annihilation treachery that gives the villain an attack with overkill. Another common villain feature is retaliate, especially on some of those hardest villains like Ronin and Venom Goblin. If the villain has retaliate, we're again incentivized to keep a healthy hit point total, but here also gains an advantage if it has access to ranged attacks. So someone like Hawkeye, whose all his arrows get ranged, all of his arrow attacks get ranged. Some Domino has her pistols that allow her to fire off ranged attacks. It also rewards heroes with high damage individual attacks, like Cable with his telekinetic blast, to help close out the game. Right? We'd rather play one attack that deals 10 damage versus attack for 5 different ways against these villains with retaliate. So I think those are the biggest 3: stalwart, overkill, and retaliate. But there's some more minor or maybe broader categories to think about as well. Right? Tough heavy scenarios. Minion heavy scenarios, maybe certain heroes that have these AoE effects like Storm's Blast of Wind are really good against these minion heavy scenarios. Side scheme heavy scenarios, high starting pressure scenarios that reward good tempo, marathon scenarios that reward consistent value generation. If you even want to get even more specific, someone like Venom Goblin, if you're playing with the Goblin Gear modular set, you have this card Advanced Goblin Glider, that can only be discarded by 3 resources worth of attack events. So this is like an incredibly specific answer that is sort of demanded of your deck. And some heroes like Nova don't have a single 3-cost attack, so you need to get lucky with drawing a few in hand. It's like sort of a perfect example of how you might have a very, very strong hero, but if all you test against is like Venom Goblin, he can just punish you because of this particular scenario feature. So I think this mentality, it does a few things. For one, I think it's helped me enable my shift into these higher difficulty levels, right? Not just thinking about heroes and decks in isolation, but just how they relate to specific scenarios, how we might round out our deck or our multiplayer team to have answers for some of these things that commonly come up. Maybe like a card like Sidearm that gives an ally range. Maybe it's not like a hugely powerful card in our deck, but we just want to give ourselves a bit more coverage against retaliate because we think that's a weakness for our deck. Something I do a lot, and I know most people don't do this, but for my heroic games, I tend to tech pretty strongly against the specific scenario, just because that makes for really fun games for me. But if I'm trying to build a more general deck, then I'll do this sort of cover all my bases. I'll make sure I'm not wholly dependent on ally blocking or wholly dependent on stunning in order to stay alive. We'll spread it a bit in case the villain has steady or the villain has overkill. So this sort of coverage can really make for nice, well-rounded decks. I also want to use this to, give one of my soapboxes here, but I want to caution you away from thinking things like, X hero can beat Ronin, so therefore it's an S tier hero. Or, this hero can't beat Ronin or Venom Goblin, so it must be worse than this other hero who can, right? That those heroes, it might just have a better matchup against that particular scenario. But say maybe you switch to a different scenario, maybe the one that lost to Ronin, it's like a minion slaying specialty deck. And so you go against some heroic mutagen formula, put in a Wrecking Crew mod set, and maybe the outcome's reversed because this one deck was just made to handle minion heavy scenarios better, and this other one that's focused on like good defense events to answer Ronin is like not just as equipped to deal with that scenario. So especially if we're comfortable playing heroic, if we're comfortable adding difficulty in other ways, we can still have these hard, challenging matchups. But if for whatever reason you don't like, most people will just play against, Ronin or Venom Goblin or Magneto. Those are kind of the big three. And if you can beat those, then you've got, an S tier hero. And I would contend that there's lots of ways to make difficult scenarios that can really push the limits of your hero. And if you just have a particularly bad matchup against one of those, you might hold yourself back from recognizing the value in certain decks that you have and in certain heroes. So just one of the influences I would like to see for my channel is just normalizing these alternate methods of creating high difficulty scenarios to test your heroes, to test your decks, rather than just playing the same scenarios over and over again. Because the specific matchup in a game, that just significantly alters how good your hero looks. So with that, I will wrap up my hero evaluation video. Hope this gave you some tips and tools to analyze and optimize the hero you're interested in. Did my best to give some general advice, but each hero will of course have its own nuances and intricacies that affect how it plays. Throughout the duration of my channel, I'll definitely plan to post a few deep dive videos into individual heroes. I might not do it a ton because I really there's so many heroes in this game. I like to bounce around a lot. But definitely stay tuned. I want to do some deep dive. It's always fun to just get really master a few particular heroes. So I'm going to try to do that in a few cases for my favorite heroes. So like I said, stay tuned for those. The next video in this series is going to be my deck evaluation video. So it'll might feed very well, might overlap a bit with this one because we'll talk about building around some strengths and weaknesses of a hero. But we'll also start to focus now more on these different aspect and basic card packages that can define our deck, some general deck building guidelines overall, how much tempo, how much value, how many allies, and hope you'll join me for that. This second iteration of the series took a bit longer to come out than I thought. I like just working hard on these, scripting it out, making this presentation. It's a lot of fun for me, but it does take some time. So be patient. I have every intention to continue the 5-part series and finish it, like I said, especially with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. coming out here. Who knows how much time I'll be willing to contribute to this. But do stay tuned. They are coming. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for making it this far in the video, and bye-bye for now.